You have been one of the most well-known panpsychists and viewers of consciousness from that perspective. And I think it's really important to not just assume that everybody understands what that entails. And so could you share your definition of what panpsychist view is, and your view on consciousness?
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of physical reality. Perhaps a way into that is to, start with human consciousness, which is incredibly rich and complicated, the results of millions of years of evolution. But consciousness comes in all shapes and sizes, right? What it's like to be a sheep is a bit simpler to what it's like to be a human being.
We presume, right?
Yeah, we might want to debate that, but I guess at least working with our common sense understanding.
Well, this is just one point that I've, you in your book, Why, and have talked about a lot, how consciousness being the one thing that's not publicly observable.
Absolutely.
And so we don't fully know what the conscious experience of, for example, a sheep, a dolphin, an octopus, definitely a mantis shrimp who has 13, variations or cones of colors, right? So I don't want to interrupt too much, but yeah, it's interesting.
Well, this is one of the reasons consciousness is so intractable, because it's, as you say, it's not a publicly observable phenomenon. And then the pushback I often get to that is people say science deals with loads of unobservable things, quantum wave functions or fundamental particles, maybe even other universes. But there's a very important difference in the case of consciousness. In all these other cases, we are theorizing about things we can't observe, like fundamental particles or quantum wave functions. But we're doing that in order to explain what we can observe, in order to explain the data of observation experiments. In the unique case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is not publicly observable. We know about consciousness not from experiments. We didn't find it in a particle collider. We know about consciousness just by being conscious, right? Being immediately aware of our feelings of pleasure and pain and seeing color, hearing sound. So this really limits our capacity to deal with it experimentally. And what we can do if we're dealing with another human being is we can ask them, right? What are you experiencing? And if I do that while I'm scanning your brain, I can start to correlate which kinds of conscious experience go with which kinds of brain state in the human case, although it's already a bit of a mess even there. But then as we try and extrapolate to other mammals, to lizards, to other kinds of inanimate objects, it just gets harder and harder to do. But I guess at least our common sense understanding is that as we get to simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. What it's like to be a snail, if there is something that it's like to be a snail, is much simpler than what it's like to be a sheep or a human being. For the panpsychist, this keeps going down to the fundamental building blocks of reality, with maybe fundamental particles like electrons and quarks having incredibly simple forms of conscious experience to reflect their incredibly simple nature. So that sounds a bit weird, but I think it does manage to make sense of a lot of the mysteries we're struggling with at the present moment.
Yeah, I think on the path in pursuit of truth, anyone has to honestly ask themselves, what is it they truly know versus what are beliefs, presumptions. In exploring the nature of reality, consciousness is the one thing we're truly intimate with. Mm-hmm. It's like the one thing that I can actually be certain of in this moment is that I am, that I exist, that I am having an experience. And many of the things that we seem or claim to know in our external reality are really, our relation to it is separate in the sense of I have an icon or an image or a projection of you inside of myself. And so it is interesting that consciousness is the one thing not publicly observable, and on the flip side, the one thing that we have direct access to.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, Andre, how you put in that. I suppose we've got to start with how do we know about reality? So that's a big question. And I think in a way we know about reality in two different ways, at least two different ways anyway. We know about consciousness, just by being conscious. As you say, it's the one thing we're directly in contact with. If you're in pain, you're just directly aware of your pain. But then we know about the physical world somewhat indirectly by using our conscious experience. And then as we do that a bit better, we get science. And then the fundamental challenge is, how do these two things we know about in very different ways fit together? Is the physical world fundamental? And maybe consciousness emerges from physical processes in the brain? Or is it the other way around, as the panpsychist thinks? Is mind or consciousness fundamental, and physical reality emerges from some more fundamental story about mind or consciousness? This is one of the big questions, and unfortunately, there is no experiment you can do to decide which of those is correct. All of our scientific data is just neutral, is compatible with both of those possibilities. So what do? We could say, we don't know. Maybe we just don't know. Or we can just try and evaluate these different hypotheses, maybe in terms of simplicity, maybe in terms of how well they do with their explanatory aspirations, and just try and work out which looks more plausible. And I think when we do that, panpsychism, the view that mind or consciousness is the fundamental basis of reality, starts to look like the more plausible contender.